The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to this ISO 14001-2015 webinar, Transition Essentials. As you can see from the slide, my name is Richard Walsh. I'm the Energy and Environment Principal Assessor for NQA, based in the UK. And over the next hour or so, we're going to be having a look at the what's now 18 months old version of ISO 14001, published in September 2014. But we will particularly be looking at it both from the content aspect, but also from a view of what we as a certification body will be expecting to see on some of the slides, on some of the slides, on some of the sections within the standard. So one of the questions we get asked most often now is, with a good understanding of what the clause actually says, but we're a little bit unsure about what you as an assessment body would want to see. So hopefully on the slide in front of you, you should be able to see an outline of the course. Before I get too far in, let me just say that you will be sent, we have everybody's email addresses, you will be sent a PDF copy of the presentation within 3 to 4 days of this webinar. So hopefully either by the end of this week, more likely possibly early next week, you will get a PDF copy. So there's no need to frantically write down everything that I say or that you see in front of you. Also on the dashboard, you should have a box that says chat. And in there should always be something now that says, please submit your questions in the chat box throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions as we go along, then please type them in there. I'll be able to see that and I'll try and answer them as we get to them. Hopefully, I'm going to speak for about an hour, usually about 45-50 minutes of content, and then 5 or 10 minutes towards the end, in which we can answer any questions. If there's any questions that pop up and I think it's pertinent to answer them at the time, then I will do that. Any questions that I don't get to answer, if there's anything that you particularly want to ask, or you think when we're finished you'd like to ask, I don't mind if you wanted to email me directly. My email address, if you want to write this down because it isn't in any of the slides, is richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh@nqa.com. So that's all the housekeeping stuff out the way, and a little bit there about the outline of the next hour or so. So as I say, we're going to have a look at the concepts of ISO 14001-2015, touch on a little bit of the terminology and some definitions that were introduced in the standard. Have a look particularly at some specific clauses. In fact, we'll look at all of the clauses, but we'll look at a few clauses and specifically talk about the evidence that we as an assessment body, or I as an assessor, would want to see if I was carrying out an assessment to the standard. Have a look at some transition timelines, some notable dates. There is only one notable date left, but we'll come on to that. And then a little bit of advice at the end on how best to prepare for the changes and implications for maintaining certification. So within the new standard, within 14001-2015, there are some new and modified overarching concepts. The three main ones are these intended outcomes. All of the new standards, and this goes for 9001-2015 as well, all of the new standards have an intended outcome. And the main intended outcome of ISO 14001 is the enhancement of an organization's environmental performance. That's what you're expected to achieve. That's what we'll be looking for as we come in and carry out a continued series of certification visits. There's also the fulfillment of compliance obligations. Compliance obligations, as we'll see shortly, if you like, are the new terminology for legal and other requirements, and also the achievement of set environmental objectives. Another area that is within the standard and has been sort of heightened, if you like, is the management of change. No business stands still, all businesses change, and the standard itself is available to be used by people as a tool for managing change within the business, particularly obviously change of an environmental nature. And the sections on managing change help focus on the planning process, help you manage the risk associated with changes, and also by using the standard and integrating it with other standards and other business processes will help you manage the overall change process. A number of key definitions that crop up within the standard. Persons doing work under its control, same as the old version of the standard, but does now reflect the difference between where you may have full control over something that's happening maybe outside of the business, or you may only have a degree of influence, and that's an accepted concept within the standard, that there are now differing levels of control or influence that you can exert over people who are doing work under control. Obviously, if it's an employee, you've got full control over what they do. If it's a supplier or a subcontractor, you may only have a varying degree of influence. Environmental performance, as I've said, that's the key to the whole standard. It's the key expected outcome, and that refers to the environmental results that are achieved whenever the aspects of your activities, processes, products and services are managed and controlled. So in other words, we're looking for improvements in how your organizations perform environmentally. Documented information is now a catch-all term. It's replaced a whole raft of other terminology, things like documents, records, forms. Everything is now called documented information. Compliance obligations, as the bit in brackets you'll see states, talks a little bit about legal and other requirements. Everything's now known as a compliance obligation. Interestingly, the standard does still permit, if you want to use that term, the standard does still permit you to use the term legal and other requirements if you're more comfortable with that. And as I said, the intended outcome applies to all of the new standards now, and this is what is expected to be achieved by an organisation who implements that particular standard. So just a few development timeline dates. Looking backwards, I think I need to just slightly update this slide because one of the arrows has moved on a little bit now. However, the draft standard was published in 2014, and ultimately the current version, the 2015 standard, was published on the 15th of September 2015. There is a client transition period from the date of publication. Anybody with the old version of the standard has 3 years in which to make the transition to the new standard. And any standards that, well, any certificates, should I say, that we issue to the old standard, so if people haven't carried through the transition yet and we do a recertification visit, any certificates we issue now have an expiry date, if the certificate is to the old standard, of the 14th of September 2018. And anybody not transitioning by that date sadly will be left high and dry without certification, and your certificates will just expire. Just a reminder, key date 14th of September 2018. This was a slide I showed from some of my earlier presentations, a little bit about when I was introducing the standard, talking about why we'd got to where we were. I'm not going to read all of these out, but mainly the standard has changed because, as you're probably aware, the way we view the environment, the environmental pressures placed upon us have all changed quite dramatically over the last 10 or 12 years. Obviously the old standard was 2004, so it was 11 years since the previous standard had been published, and it's expected that this standard will probably last again for about 10 years. So if we continue, if we extrapolate forward with this level of change that we've seen over the last 10 years, then this standard is going to have to be able to manage possibly some quite significant changes in the environment. as with all of the new standards being published, 9001 and ISO 45001, which is due to be published now at the end of this year, which replaces OSAS 18001 on health and safety, all of the standards now follow this Annex SL sort of process, and it's a structure, I call it an empty standard. It's a template on how all of the new standards are written. So they all have 10 clauses. We're interested in clauses 4 to 10. They are the auditable clauses. Little bit of confusion sometimes creeps in on clause 1, because clause 1 refers to scope. It does not refer to the scope of your management system. We'll come on to that shortly. Clause 10 refers to the scope of the standard itself, and it sets the scene about why the standard is there and talks about the expected outcomes, etc., etc. So we're going to have a look through the 7 main auditable clauses, starting with the context of the org. All of the management standards follow what's known as the Deming cycle. If you've worked in quality management, the Deming cycle is also known as Plan, Do, Check, Act, and that is the Plan, Do, Check, Act model with the names of the clauses actually added onto there. So clause 1, internal and external issue, so 4.1, 4.2, needs and expectations of interested parties, and so on. I like to do things slightly differently and tend to prefer to see things set out in a linear fashion. So this is what I find quite a useful slide, because it shows the 4 auditable clauses with the Plan, Do, Check, Act, but then shows the sub-clauses underneath. So there's starting with the context of the organisation and the sections understanding of the organisation, expectations of interested parties, scope, and the AMS itself, and that follows all the way across. So that's just another way of looking at that Plan, Do, Check, Act. Set out like this. The bits in black you would see in all of the standards. So if we were looking at the elements of 9001 2015, the text that in black you would still see. What you wouldn't see are the bits that are in green. So those are the bits that are worded or named specifically for an environmental management system, and are some slightly different terminology used in ISO 9001. But as you can see, the whole idea of the new standards is to help integration, and if you were to integrate 9001 and 14001, all the bits in black would be covering both standards. So let's move on and have a look at now the clauses themselves, and also have a look at how we would expect to see you evidence some of these particular clauses. So clause 4, then, the context of the organisation, and the whole idea of this clause is to provide a high-level strategic understanding of the important issues that can affect positively or negatively the way in which you manage your environmental responsibilities. We also, within this clause, look at the needs and expectations of interested parties. We look at the scope of the system, and we look about how the fact that the scope should be made available as documented information. So taking those bullet points in order, so you need to determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to the purpose of your environmental management system. So in other words, what are the relevant issues, both internally and externally, that can affect your ability to achieve the expected outcome? And if you remember, the expected outcome is improved environmental performance. So the requirement here is to consider your organisation's context, also to consider the needs of interested parties, stakeholder concerns, and the whole idea of this is to ensure that you focus on the issues that present the greatest risk, either positive or negative, in achieving environmental improvements. Now, what sort of things are we looking for? Some of you may have come across the term PESL analysis that looks at political, economic, social, and so on, different types of conditions that can affect a business. I tend to distill them down into 3 main areas: environmental conditions, So these are the things that are related to your environmental aspect. Climate change is a big one, external and internal. So one of the big changes between this version of the standard and the previous version of the standard in this particular area is, and it's a phrase I've started using more and more now, is that we have to consider how the environment impacts on us. So one of the things I've been saying to people is that for years and years, we've been throwing things at the environment. We've been putting emissions into the atmosphere, throwing things down the drains, putting things in rivers, etc., etc. It's now starting to throw things back at us. We're seeing more extreme weather, particularly linked to climate change. So we have to take this into account. It's not just how we impact on the environment, it's what's the environment impacting us on. So in other words, we need to consider if, for instance, we're in an area that's prone to flooding, is that going to affect us? If so, how is it going to affect us? What's the risk? What do we have to take into account? So these are the different areas that we have to consider when we are now looking at the sort of potential key issues. Just as a reminder, the intent is to provide a high-level conceptual understanding. So this is something that we expect to see not necessarily carried out, but understood at board level as to what are the main issues that we have to consider within our environment system. Interested parties are a part of this process, so we need to identify who they are, and then we need to decide what they actually want from us, what they can legitimately expect us to provide them with. And once we've decided what they are and we become aware of them, these then become compliance obligations. So for instance, legislation is a compliance obligation. It's something we have to achieve. We have to meet all applicable environmental legislation. We have no say in whether we do or not. There are also voluntary obligations. It's an interesting phrase, voluntary obligations. There was some debate about whether you could have a voluntary obligation. The feeling is yes, you can. And the example I always give is of a haulage company that may have to pass a row of houses down a small lane to get to their yard. Planning consent allows them to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. However, for the sake of the residents who live in the houses, they have an undertaking that they will not operate vehicles up and down the lane after, say, 10 o'clock at night and before 7 in the morning. There's nothing in legislation to say that, but that is a voluntary arrangement that they've come up with to enhance the quality of life for the residents. That becomes a voluntary obligation. It's something they've taken on voluntarily, but it's still an obligation. They're expected to meet it and should therefore be listed within the register, if you like, of voluntary obligations. And voluntary obligations, as I've said, voluntary arrangements become obligations when they're agreed and adopted. Interested parties, you've probably seen slides like this before. To be honest, I could have said just about anybody who has a legitimate interest in the activities of the business, be they employees, be they board members, be they neighbours, the people that operate or maybe live next door, live across the road, customers, suppliers, the regulator, be that if you're in the UK, the Environment Agency, governments, local governments, and community or pressure groups even. So anybody who has a legitimate interest in what you do, they all have an interest, they all have expectations, and you need to know and understand what those are. Still within this same section of the manual is the scope. We have to decide on what are going to be the physical boundaries of our management system. It can be a whole or a part of the organisation. You choose. So for instance, if you are part of a larger group that may have a number of different manufacturing sites, you can legitimately certify just one of the sites within the business. However, it can't be used to exclude significant environmental aspects or evade compliance obligations. So if you know that you've got a part of the site that you're not happy about, you're not happy with, in fact, you might be embarrassed about, you can't draw a line around that and say, well, we'll ignore that bit. The scope mustn't be misleading, so the wording of the scope must reflect exactly what we're talking about. So if, for instance, you have chosen one manufacturing site, maybe out of 7 or 8 that you've got, you cannot claim that the certification covers the whole organisation. You would have to say it would cover the activities of XYZ company at its Manchester site or Liverpool site or wherever we are. And a new requirement in all of this is that we have to now, or organisations have to make the wording of the scope available to interested parties. Now, in the old standard, it was only the policy that had to be made available to interested parties. We now have to make the scope available. Now, one of the things I said I was going to try and do was just touch on a little bit about how we might start to see some of this evidence. I've deliberately left it till now because this whole first section has an amount of evidence that we have to make available. There is no requirement to document the outcome of the discussions or the thoughts that you might have on the context of the organisation. You need to pull together the expectations, the compliance obligations. What we quite often see is that once people have gone through that process, if they're going to retain an environmental manual, and that's not a given, you don't have to retain an environmental manual now, but if you do, most people have kept them. What we tend to see is that the opening section is a little bit of an introduction to the company. This is who we are, this is what we do, this is what's important to us, these are the things that can affect us. So a little bit of setting the scene, who we are, what we do, a little bit maybe about key stakeholders. But then when we come on to the policy, which we're going to look at in the next section on leadership, quite often the policy now starts off with, again, setting the scene. So it will start off with the wording of the scope. So it will say, we as XYZ PLC, with the scope, manufacture of whatever it is at our site in Manchester, have the following an environmental policy. So that's one way of showing it. Another way, which is a way that we would encourage also, is a lot of people now put information on the website. When you get your certificate, whether it's from NQA or another certification body, that will have the wording of the scope on there. And it would be perfectly legitimate to have a downloadable PDF version of your policy on the website. Either of those ways would actually meet the requirements of the standard. Finally, and the bit in red on the first line is very, very important. The section called Environmental Management System, this tells you basically what you have to have as part of the system. You have to establish, implement, maintain, and now continually improve your environmental management system to achieve the intended outcomes. And as we've said, that's improvement in environmental performance. This bit, continually improve, is important now because it's becoming, as we'll see shortly, it is a policy commitment. I go in and audit businesses where I look at procedures that haven't changed for getting on for 20 years. I think the record I've seen is a company, not an environment to be honest, but a company with a quality system where some of the documents, some of the procedures were written in 1993. And bear in mind, we're now in 2017. So I think it would be very difficult for that company to justify that their management system has continually improved. So we'll have a look at that, and we'll have a look at what we mean by that shortly. The standard requires that the management system is actually integrated into the wider business processes. So it's not a standalone process. It's not something that you do in a box. So in other words, this is what we do, but actually over here we've got Fred who looks after our environmental management system. I don't know what he does, but actually he manages that. And the environmental management system doesn't affect anything we do on a day-to-day basis. That's not how it works. The management system has to be now integrated into all the different areas of the business and has to form a way of working that ensures that all areas of the business consider environment, whether it's a design and development section, whether it's procurement, whether it's sales and marketing, whoever it is, they need to have environment involved in what they are carrying. Leadership and commitment is a new clause. It's an area that a number of senior managers that I've spoken to are a little bit worried about. Don't worry about it if you are a senior manager. Basically, the main change for me, the way I've been describing this to people, is all it's done, it's taken what was a fairly reactive clause in the old standard and made it more proactive. So leadership is a little bit more proactive than management commitment. What I don't want to see is as an MD said to me a couple of years ago, well, I signed the policy and come to the management review. What more do you want me to do? It is a bit more than that, as we'll see. So it's all about making sure that the EMS, building on the last slide, isn't managed in isolation and isn't managed separately from the core strategy of the business. And it's one of the things that we will have a conversation with a managing director over this clause. So we'll be needing to ask how the environment is considered when strategic business decisions are made. If a business starts to look at a new product line, if it starts to offer a new service, if it decides to maybe operate from a new set of premises, how has the environment been taken into account as part of that, the planning process? Quite often, I find at the moment that the environmental managers are the last person to know. And quite often will say to me, if only I'd have known this at the start, we could have planned this slightly better. That can't happen anymore. That would be an issue if that was said during an audit now. So this is all about coming from the top, making sure that the environment is at the core, at the heart of what the business does. Top management is defined as the person or group of people who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. So if it's a company-wide EMS across a number of sites, it is essentially the board we're talking about. And there will need to be, as part of an environmental certification visit, there would need to be an interview with the senior staffs, the top management of the organisation. If, as we were talking about earlier, you'd maybe adopted the management system at an individual site and not across the whole business, then the senior manager within that site, so the plant manager or factory manager, whatever the position they hold, would actually be the top manager. There may be some links to group or company executives because there may be an issue in terms of provision of resources, but for the day-to-day management of the management system, the leadership would be with the local plant manager. And the new standard requires specifically that top management now take accountability for the effectiveness of the environmental management. So the policy itself has to be appropriate to what an organisation does. Can't be somebody else's that you just copied out, has to reflect the nature, scale and environmental impact of the activities, products and services. It sets a framework for environmental objectives. It's to be documented, has to be written down and has to be made available to interested parties. No change there from the other standard, the old standard. Communicated internally, obviously, and externally, and has to have 3 basic commitments. So there is a commitment to protect the environment, and we'll look at that in the next slide, to fulfill the organisation's compliance obligations. That's a little bit like the old standard that said you had to basically meet or exceed, if you chose to say that, legislative requirements. And there has to be this commitment now to continually improve the EMS. And the way the standard expects you to improve your environmental performance is through the continual improvement of your environmental management system. So the additional policy commitment, protection of the environment, what is it about? What have we got to do? What are we expecting to see? I had one managing director last year, back end of last year, who said to me, does it really mean I've got to nail bird boxes to all the trees on my site? Now, fine, if you want to do that, don't let me stop you. That's not really what it means. In the same way as I described the difference between management commitment and leadership, protection of the environment, I feel, the nub of what the standard is getting at is to try and get you to start to be thinking about things proactively. So again, rather than waiting for something to happen, it's all about managing the risk. It's about looking at what can go wrong. How can we mitigate what we're doing before things even happen? But again, making sure that everything we do as a business has the environment at the heart of it. Protection of the environment does include prevention of pollution, so that bit hasn't gone away, but it's just one of the areas now under this umbrella, protection of the environment. But there's a whole load of things at the bottom that it can include. I'm not going to read them out. You can read those for yourself. But there's a whole number of things, and it is of course going to vary from business. Roles, responsibilities and authorities hasn't really changed from the old standard. I've also brought in clause 7.1 into here because I think this sort of fits in about the provision of resources. So we're saying that responsibilities for environmental matters have to be assigned across the business. People need to know what their responsibilities are. There is no formal requirement in this standard anymore for an environmental manager, nor is there in 9001 for quality manager. Don't worry, I've yet to go to a business who've said they're going to sack the environmental manager. That isn't going to happen. The purpose behind that is to try and get away from this, oh, it's his job or it's her job. It's to demonstrate that there is a collective responsibility across the business for managing environment. But whoever carries out this role, whether it's an individual or whether it's a collective responsibility, there are two key roles. One's to ensure that the management system conforms to the requirements of the standard, and that's really what we check when we come in, and also to report on the performance of the system itself and how the business is performing environmentally to top management. And then obviously there is a requirement for resources to be provided to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the management system. So having worked out what's important to us, having worked out what are the things that can potentially pose a risk, we now have to start to plan to address the issues that we came up with earlier that we need to address. So we need to think about what our intended outcomes are. So again, back to enhancement of environmental performance, compliance obligation fulfillment, and achieving our objectives. And we're looking to try and prevent or reduce undesired effects. And those are significant environmental impacts. So that stays the same as the old standard. And also to think about more now the environmental conditions that are affecting our organisation. So again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, what is it the environment's throwing at us? How is it affecting, or how can it affect how we work? It might be simple as, like I said, flooding. It could be snow. It could be high wind. It could be all sorts of things. But we're trying through this clause to ensure that we achieve, as the final bullet point says, continual improvement. So what we've got to do is to prioritise those issues with potential adverse or beneficial effects. So we're back into fairly familiar territory. We're back into thinking about what it is that we do that impacts on the environment. How does the environment impact upon us? And we have to try and prioritise that. So we need to think about the significance. We need to think about what our compliance obligations are. What have we promised to do? What are we enforced to do by the relevant legislation? Think about any other issues that can have this adverse or possibly beneficial effect on the organisation. Some companies are taking advantage of climate change and see that as an operating opportunity. There's a new niche area that they can work in. So that's maybe something to think about. But the prioritisation is based on, can we achieve, how is it to achieve the intended outcome? How is it going to contribute to our intended outcome? How can we prevent adverse effects, and how is this going to help us achieve continual? So I'm not going to go through this slide in detail because there isn't much change from the old standard other than the very final bullet point, which is to use a life cycle perspective. One of the key differences between the old standard and the new standard is that it's a little bit like now crossing a two-way street. The old standard was more concerned with what we do as a business and how we affect the environment. In other words, what are we throwing at the environment? What are we expecting it to have to soak up? We now are crossing a two-way street. So as well as saying that this is what the environment is doing to us, we also have to think about our supply chain. We look at the term that's used more often now is the value chain, and the value chain is looking further along from where we are. So that's looking at our clients, our customers, and maybe their customers, maybe right the way to the disposal of our product, but also looking backwards about our supply chain. Where do our materials come from? How do things get to us? Is there are there significant environmental issues with what we're buying? Are we buying the best environmental options? So purchasing has become a part of ISO 14001 now. So those of you with quality management systems who are used to an assessor asking about delivery times of goods, quality of goods being bought, etc., will now want to ask about the sustainability of what it is that you're buying. What you don't have to do for everything is to do a full life cycle assessment, but you have to demonstrate that you have considered upstream as well as downstream environmental impact. Compliance obligations hasn't changed other than its terminology, and you still, if you like, can call it legal under the requirements. That is an option in the standard. Basically, the standard requires you to determine and have access to the relevant compliance obligations. So what are they? What is it that you've promised to do? What relevant pieces of legislation are there out there? Determine how they apply to your organisation and then take them into account within the EMS. So if you are operating with a discharge consent to put effluent down the drain, you will have to consider how you meet the requirements of that effluent consent, how you need to monitor, measure, plan your operation to ensure that you retain compliance to that requirement. Sorry about that. That sounds to be my phone that's just ringing. You also then need to think about the risk that compliance obligations can actually achieve. Now, obviously, there is a risk of non-compliance with legislation. That's not an acceptable risk. You cannot accept that as a valid risk. Whilst the standard allows a risk management principle, you cannot apply that to non-compliance with legislative issues. The rest of the standard does allow you to carry out a risk management process. Having identified what the risk is, we then need to think about how we're going to plan to mitigate that risk. It's a little bit like health and safety. So we carry out a risk assessment, we see what the risk is, and then we try and decide what can we do to reduce that risk or to make the risk acceptable. So we need to think about how the actions that we carry out, how the processes that we operate are integrated into our EMS. We need to look at how we are going to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. And we need to consider what options we've got. What technological options have we got? What budgets are we having to work within? And what are the requirements of our business? So this section, planning action, details how you plan to take action, but isn't actually the detailed planning itself. Not yet. That comes along in another in the next clause. So this thinks about the methodology that we need to go through in order to plan the actions we need to take. So the next slide then is objectives and to achieve them. And this is a policy commitment. So we do have to improve the EMS, and we do have to improve our environmental performance. You'll notice the term target has been removed from the standard itself. It's now objectives and planning to achieve them. Still a target in my book, and if you want to call it a target by all means, but the standard itself doesn't use that terminology anymore. However, the objectives that you set have to be consistent with your policy commitments. So if you've made a commitment to reduce the energy that we use, then obviously you would need to have an objective to show you're going to achieve that and how you're going to achieve it. Objectives have to be measurable if they can. I accept sometimes that they may not be fully measurable, but really we're looking for objectives to be measurable. They need to be monitored. They need to be communicated and documented within the business, and they need to be updated on a regular basis. So when you're planning to carry out these objectives, when you plan to carry out the actions to reduce the risks, we need to think about who's going to carry them out, what they're going to do, and when's it going to be done, what resources are we going to require, what relevant indicators are we going to use. And this is the first time really that 14001 has started to ask us to think about performance indicators. So performance indicator might not just be a measurement of, say, the amount of energy we use, but maybe an indicator might look at the amount of energy that it takes to produce one product, whatever it is, whatever piece of product we're making. It might be kilowatt hours of electricity per widget, whatever it is we're producing. But we also need to make sure that the achievement of these objectives is integrated into our business processes and that we're not working against what the business is trying to achieve. I'm going to skip through this clause pretty quickly. It's 20 to 5, and we've still a few slides to get through. So this section is very, very similar to the old 2004 clause, other than it's now talking about competency much more than just training and awareness. Competency can cover a whole range of things, including training, but we have to ensure that people are competent on the basis of their education, training, or experience. And we have to maintain records. So where we rely on the competency of somebody to carry out a task, and I always say there's two extreme ways of managing a task. One is to very heavily document it. The other extreme is to manage it purely through the competency of the person carrying it out. Where you're relying on competency, we will expect to see set competency levels. So in other words, what do we need that person carrying out that task to be able to do? And then how are you managing and monitoring that competence? Again, a clause with very minimal change, awareness. So people carrying out work under your control, and that includes contractors, need to be aware of the policy and the commitments you're making as a business, the significant aspects of their work, how they can contribute to the effectiveness of your system, and also the implications of not conforming. And to be honest, it's a little bit more than I sometimes, the answer I sometimes get when I'm carrying out an assessment is, well, when they sign in, we give them a copy of the policy. It's a little bit more than that. Now, some businesses I go carry out, so some clients actually have contractor inductions where environment and health and safety feature fairly heavily. So it's a little bit more than just asking people to sign in before they come on site. And again, communication, broadly similar to the old standard, 2 tiers of communication, internal and external. Now, interestingly, and this is something that I'm going to warn you about, I guess is probably the best phrase to use, because I've already caught a couple of people out on this. In the second part of the standard, which is the annex, so you've got the main clauses, the main 7 clauses, the auditable clauses. They are replicated towards the end of the standard in Annex A, but with a little bit more detailed explanation and a little bit of looking at the background to the clause and adding a little bit of additional information. Now, it's not auditable, is that, but it gives you some pointers on what to look for. And particularly the annex talks a little bit about external communication. And it has 5 main things that we look for now when we are assessing environmental communication. And one of the things I do, if I have time, before I visit a client, is to look at the website. Look at the environmental section in the website and look and see what your sales and marketing team are saying. And then I judge that against the following 5 pieces of criteria that are detailed at the end of the standard. External communication needs to be transparent. It needs to be appropriate. It needs to be truthful and not misleading. It needs to include all relevant information and certainly not exclude relevant information, and must be understandable to relevant parties. So if you're making claims on your website, even if you say, as I've had somebody said to me, well, that's just been written by sales, that's just there to sound good. If it's an environmental communication, if it's making environmental claims, I'll expect you to back that up. And that's something that one or two people I've already dealt with as part of the transition have ended up with non-conformances about, because the claims they're making can't be backed up. Just a quick slide to tell you really what it is you need to communicate internally and externally. Again, you'll get a copy of this, so read that at your level. Documented information, based on the 2004 version of the standard, it basically talks about making sure that you've got the right documentation in the right place at the right issue at the right time. However, a key difference is that the standard now requires you to only have documentation in a manner sufficient to demonstrate that you have a suitable, adequate and effective environmental management system. There are some required documentation, which we'll look at very shortly. It's up to you how you set them out. They can be free form, you can do whatever you want, but whatever there is available has to be controlled, has to be made available to people, and has to be protected. I, again, have clients who say to me, when I maybe make criticism of the amount of documentation or the level of documentation, the answer I get back is, well, the standard says I've got to do it like that. No, it doesn't anymore. The standard doesn't say anything about the level of documentation. If you have a very document-heavy system, that's because you have chosen to have that, and maybe that's the way that you choose to work. Having said that the terms documents and records have gone, I've now immediately come back and used those terms. Basically, what I've done here is I've gone through the standard, and everywhere where the standard says you have to retain documented information, I've put that down. I've put it back into the old terminology and called them documents and records, because I still think that's a concept that we better understand. But if before an assessment you can tick every one of those lines on that slide, you won't be far wrong in terms of your certification. Operational planning and control. If you're an environmental manager, you'll find that this is a very short section. If you're looking at the equivalent in ISO 9000 and you're a quality manager, you'll find that this is a very, very long section. In 14,001, it's half a page. In 9,001, it's about 4.5 pages. So basically, this is about how we now control our processes. So whatever it is that we're doing, whatever it is that we're carrying out, what information, what controls do we need to have in place to control our processes from an environmental perspective. So that includes things that we've identified as significant aspects, whatever we've identified as our compliance obligations, be they legislative or mandatory or voluntary that we've taken on a voluntary basis. It includes the objectives that we've set and any other risks and opportunities we might have identified. It also includes outsourced processes and control or influence, dependent on who those suppliers, who those contractors are, and whether we can have control or influence. So that's a little bit where we now start to think about purchase. So making sure that we have this life cycle perspective taken into account, so that we are also considering the controls that we place on our suppliers and our purchasing operations, we need to make sure that we have controls in place across a number of areas within the business. So we need to think about design and development, maybe looking at the life cycle of our products. We need to look at environmental requirements for procurement, communicate requirements to external providers. There's an asterisk there, because that's how you might get customer compliance obligations. Your customers may say, you've got to do this now because we've got 14,001, 2015. We now need you to be able to do this, and here's a compliance obligation. I have one customer who has to use a particular type of returnable packaging. That's a customer requirement. That is a compliance obligation and would have to be documented. So as I said, that is quite a shortish section within the standard. Following on, same requirements again as the old standard. Emergency preparedness and response, it's identical to the old standard. The only thing that's changed is where some of the information comes from. So it's all about preparing to respond to emergencies that may occur within our business, and also trying to mitigate anything that happens, but also to try and prevent things happening in the first place. but making sure that if something goes wrong, we learn from it and we try and stop it happening again. So a lot of companies haven't really changed what they've done in this particular section in terms of emergency preparedness and response, but you can read on the slide there what the standard actually requires. Now, performance evaluation, monitoring, measurement and evaluation. So you must monitor, measure, analyse and evaluate your environmental performance, and that includes how the management system itself is performing. So we need you to think about what it is you have to monitor. Now, it might be, as an example I used earlier, it might be the quality of effluent, it might be emissions from your chimneys, it might be purchasing, it might be the environmental impact, it might be carbon footprinting. There's all sorts of different things that people, excuse me, some people sometimes have to monitor or are encouraged to monitor. If you're going to monitor, you need to think about how you're going to make sure the results are valid. So do you need to use calibrated or verified equipment? If you're measuring the pH of an effluent stream, do you need to have a degree of calibration on that meter that's actually carrying out that evaluation? So what criteria are you going to use? What are the appropriate indicators? If you're measuring pH, obviously it's going to be pH, but do we need to think about, again, and I mentioned it earlier, performance indicators? What are the right performance indicators to use? When are we going to carry it out? How and when are we going to analyse the results? We have to think about communicating those results internally and externally if required. So it may be that there's some external reporting, and again, that would come back in right the way back at the start of the standard in terms of the needs of interested parties. You may have to report effluent quality back to the water company, in which case that's a reporting requirement and you would have to think about it here under performance evaluation. And of course you have to retain an element to document it to prove what you've done. Evaluation of compliance, again, hasn't changed from the old standard. You have to evaluate conformity with compliance obligations. If you go on the NQA website, you will find a blog that I wrote only about a week and a half ago on this particular subject. There is quite a misunderstanding out there in some cases in terms of what this is all about. Evaluation of compliance is not updating the legal register, to use the old terminology. It's not making sure that you have access to all the relevant legislations and requirements. That comes back under clause 6. It is about auditing, assessing, are you meeting those requirements and providing the objective evidence to demonstrate that you are. And there's a whole range of ways of carrying it out. It doesn't have to happen just once a year, as we'll see shortly, but you can use a variety of methods. You can do it by audit. You can review documentation, so you can sit down and maybe go through waste transfer notes to see, have you got the correct level of documentation. You can do a site tour. You can walk around. A lot of people just walk around with their eyes open, maybe with a camera or a smartphone now, taking pictures. So why's that dripping? What's there? What's in this skip? Why is that not being segregated? Day-to-day routine monitoring. All sorts of different things can be done to evaluate compliance. It's not just a set process. You need to think about who's going to carry it out, what level of knowledge do they need, what competencies have they got. You have to maintain knowledge of compliance status. That's why I say it's not just a once-a-year activity. You can't just say, if I was to ask about evaluation of compliance with an effluent stream, you can't say, well, actually, we checked it 10 months ago and it was okay then. And if I say, well, how is it now? Well, I don't know. We checked it 10 months ago and it was okay. So you need to maintain this knowledge of compliance status. You need to retain records. Now, interestingly, this is something I'm driving home quite strongly. If you've identified within your own system that you have a legal non-compliance, so in other words, you've identified that something is wrong and you're doing something about it, we won't raise that as a major non-conformance. If I find it and it was a surprise to you and you go, oh, crikey, I didn't realise that. I didn't know we were breaking the law on that. That's going to be a major non-conformance. But if you've identified it and you are dealing with it in the correct way, we won't penalise you for that, because that's what the management system's all about. Internal audit hasn't changed. No change at all, other than really the numbering system. It's now clause 9.2. Management review concept is still the same. Inputs, outputs. Again, nothing changed other than the terminology that's used. What I remind everybody is it's not necessarily a meeting. You read the standard, you will not see the term meeting used. Management review is a process which might involve a meeting, might not. But whatever it has, there are mandatory inputs and mandatory outputs. And again, if you can tick all of those boxes before an NQA assessment, then you shouldn't have any problems. Finally, on to improvement, and this is all about determining the opportunities for improvement and implementing actions to achieve our intended outcomes. So it's making sure that the management system itself remains suitable, remains adequate, and remains effective. And again, this is all about improving on environmental. Interestingly, the term preventive action has disappeared. Technically, most of us, and I include myself in this, have been misdefining the term preventive action. Basically, preventive action is all about stopping something happening in the first place. Once something's happened and you're then trying to stop it happening again, that is long-term or longer-term corrective action. So preventive action doesn't apply here. Non-conformity and corrective action is about resolving something, improving something that's already happened. Preventive action is now seen as part of the management of risk in the first place. Other than that, the concept remains the same. Right, we are down to the last 5 or 6 minutes. I've not had any questions as yet. I take that to mean you've either all nodded off, which I hope you haven't, or I've covered everything at the moment to your fullest satisfaction. If you've got any questions that you want to ask, now's the time to start typing them, because we are going to be finishing round about 5 minutes time. I've got about 4 or 5 slides left to go through, which I'm going to get through now. And when I get to the end, if there aren't any questions, I'll just thank you for your time and then move on. So moving on then, so the transition process itself, and this is the same for both 9001 and 14001. So if you are a quality manager, it's the same process. The changes to the standard have been deemed significant. So UCAS have decided, that's the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, have decided that these changes are significant. So it's not just a minor change. We, as a certification body, will perform what we term value-added assessments. It's not a tick box exercise. We're not just coming in to say, yes, 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 that's fine, jolly good, here's your certificate. We try as best we can to make sure that you are achieving the most effective outcome from your management system. I've seen a lot of good systems, I've seen a lot of bad systems. I know what works, I know what doesn't work. And within the bounds of what we're allowed to do in terms of helping you, then we do provide our lowest level of finding is what's called an opportunity for improvement. And that is very much a suggestion on how to improve part of your system, part of your operation. So we will carry out value-added assessments, not just a tick box. As I stressed right at the start, all old 14001 certificates, 2004 certificates will expire on the 14th of September 2018. So we now, almost exactly, just slightly over now, but almost exactly halfway through the 3-year transition. We have only a small number of our clients actually transitioned at the moment. I won't say the exact figure, but it's less than a third. Now, what's concerning us a little bit is that everybody's leaving it to the last minute, and people are sitting there thinking, oh, September 2018, that's a long way off. Yeah, we don't have to worry about that just yet. Try not to do that, because there is a resource issue. we have to try and meet this resource. And if everybody leaves it to the very last minute, then we're going to be swamped and we're going to find that people are let down. And we can't extend that date on the 14th of September. If you haven't transitioned, no matter whose fault it is, whether it's your fault or our fault for not being able to get out to you, if you come to us on the 1st of September and say, I need an audit and I need it quickly, if we can't meet that, and it would be unlikely that we could, your certificate's going to expire. So 3 ways of carrying it out. We recommend it's done when you would be having a recertification visit. That's the best way. It can be done when you have a normal surveillance visit, or it can be done at any time, but obviously if it's a special visit, there would be an additional charge for that. Also, and we've done this for a couple of clients, we can carry out a pre-assessment. So we can come in and do I'd call it a mock assessment, if you like. So we'll come in and tell you where you are, how you are, and sort of tell you what you need to improve, and we can carry out this preliminary evaluation. Has no bearing on the formal certification process itself, and would actually add some value, if you like, but would give you that level of reassurance. And anything that we find wouldn't be counted against you, wouldn't be used as part of the assessment. If you want to do that, speak to your assessor or drop NQA sales an email. So what is the process? We'll contact you about a month before your expected transition audit. We do that to ensure that you're ready. You must have completed, prior to the commencement of the audit, a gap analysis form. If you're an NQA customer, you should have had that now. If you haven't, next time you see your assessor, next time you speak to your assessor, ask them for it. If it gets to 30 days before and an assessor rings to make sure that you're still okay for the transition, if you still haven't got it, ask them at that point. It's a gap analysis form, and it goes through all of the clauses of the standard and asks you to identify what you've actually done to carry out that element of the transition. You must also have carried out, before the transition, a management review against the new standard. And it may be that it's a partial management review which looks at the output of the gap analysis, and that is possible. However, you must notify NQA that you intend to carry out an upgrade to the standard. If we just turn up and we weren't expecting a transition and you just say, oh, well, seeing as you're here, we might as well do it, that isn't going to happen. We can't just turn up and suddenly have it dropped on us that there's going to be a transition. Last slide, still no questions. So I'm assuming that I've answered all your questions, all your concerns. So top tips, what would I advise you to do? It's a chance to take a completely fresh look at your management system. Start again, go right the way back to first principles. Have a look at it, update it, think about it. It may be a system you've had in place for a long, long time. It's a chance to completely refresh it. Visit our website, NQA website. Even if you're not an NQA client, it's all the information's there. You can access the most up-to-date support and transition material, and there's a whole section of information. I've written quite a few blogs, as have some of my colleagues, looking at not just 14,001, but 9,001 as well in terms of quality. Look at the key changes that we're having to make and identify them themselves as opportunities for improvement. The standard has improved some areas, is my belief. Take that opportunity, take those improvements and use them yourselves. Make whatever changes you need to your documentation to reflect the new structure. Some people have removed some areas of documentation, and that's quite permissible. Make sure that you've implemented the new requirements on leadership and risk, and also the context of the organisation. So make sure that you've covered that. Make sure that your managing directors, chairs, etc., know what they are expected to do, and also then review the effectiveness of the current controls that are in place. I've just had a note to say that there are loads of questions. I can't see any of the questions on there. I do apologise for that. I don't quite know why I can't see any of them. I can see the webinar organiser saying that there are some questions, but they've not appeared in my chat box, unfortunately. So what we'll do, we will see those questions and we will be able to get back to you with answers on those. So, as I say, review the effectiveness of the controls, assume that every control may have to be changed, and then carry out the gap analysis on this form TR6 that we've talked about. So that's the end. I apologise for not being able to answer any of the questions because I can't see any of them, unfortunately. However, I can promise you we will get back to you on the questions. We just remind you we are going to email this out as a PDF file within the next few working days, and I thank you for your time. If you didn't get a question asked, clearly not, I will then be able to come back to you with an email. So email me at richard.walsh@nqa.com if you have a particular question. Other than that, now that I can see them now, I'll try and get through a couple. I'm just looking at the time. If you want to go, I understand it's 5:05 now. I'll try and just cover a couple of them. Is there still a difference between compliance and conformance? He's gone offline now, so I won't answer that. What is a good free source of environmental legislation updates? That's the question everybody has. If you're in Scotland, if you are in Northern Ireland, then NetRegs is still available, and that is a very, very good resource provided by the relative governments. Gov.uk does give you some information as well. If you also subscribe to NQA in Touch, which is a free monthly email resource, that also gives you legal updates. I tend to do the legal updates for that. If the legislation does not include a period for transition of legislation, what is seen as an acceptable timing to ensure an organisation is compliant? There is no acceptable timing. We expect you to be compliant. If legislation changes, you need to follow that change straight away. All legislation tends to come out for evaluation first, so there should be no excuse if you're caught on the hop. So there is no sort of acceptable timing. I'm going to leave it at that. Looking at the other questions, I think most of them have been covered. Exceptional presentation, thank you. I always take positive comments. Could I have a copy of the presentation? Yes, you can. What are the main underlying issues which organisations are not achieving in certification? Again, the main issue I'm finding is legislation and not covering all areas of compliance that are required, forgetting to look at the voluntary obligations, forgetting to look at things like customer requirements. The example I gave, like packaging and things like that. So I'll leave it at that. I'll try and cover any. We've got details of everybody who's asked a question. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time. Apologies that I've gone now 6 minutes over, but thanks a lot. I see about half of you have left. There's still 80 odd of you hanging around. So thanks for your time, and I'll hopefully bump into you at some point. Thank you very much for your time and efforts in, if you like, listening to the presentation. Thank you very much.